The void held its breath in the Endros expanse, a region of the galaxy usually teeming with the frenetic pulse of nascent Ta'au expansion. Here, however, silence reigned, a palpable weight pressing down upon the shattered remains of a vessel adrift between nameless stars. It was a hulk of imperial design, though its heraldry was scarred beyond recognition. Its once proud Aquila reduced to a rusted, skeletal mockery. For untold cycles, it had drifted, a tomb ship bearing forgotten horrors and the chilling echo of a final, desperate struggle. It was into this stillness that the maw of Vorlog, a Kroot war sphere, entered, not with the calculated precision of a Tau cruiser, but with the predatory grace of a hunter scenting blood in the wind. The Kroot aboard, a splinter kindred known informally as the Blood Feathers for their crimson-stained quills and aggressive tendencies, had been drawn by a faint, almost imperceptible psychic resonance, a dying thought, a residual imprint of desperation and cold fury that promised rich genetic pickings. Under the guidance of Shaper Krask, a hulking specimen whose quills bore the marks of countless battles and a mind steeped in the collective memories of generations, a shuttle disembarked. It was a crude craft, functional and unadorned, reflecting the Kroot ethos of practicality over aesthetics. Within, a vanguard of Kroot warriors, their pulse rifles held ready, their beady eyes scanning the void for threats, followed Krask. Their natural stealth allowed them to navigate the debris field, a nebula of twisted metal and frozen corpses like phantoms. The airlock of the Imperial hulk was a gaping maw of ruptured adamantium, torn open by what could only have been a catastrophic internal explosion. Entering the ship was like stepping into a sarcophagus. The internal atmosphere was frigid, thick with the metallic tang of dried blood, scorched promethium, and the acrid, lingering scent of ozone from energy weapons. Luminescent fungi, an insidious life form that thrived on decay, pulsed faintly on the bulkheads, casting an ethereal, sickly green glow that danced with the shadows, animating the silent dead. The Blood Feathers moved with a primal grace, their digitigrade legs barely whispering against the buckled deck plating. They were attuned to the vibrations, the subtle currents of the air, the faint echoes of violence that permeated the vessel. Krask, at the head of the pack, felt it strongest, the presence that had called them. It wasn't the raw, animalistic energy of a simple prey beast, nor the thrumming, alien fear of a Xenos entity. It was something else entirely, a residue of intellect, of unwavering conviction, of an almost spiritual abhorrence for all that was not human. They passed through corridors littered with the grim tableau of a last stand. Servitors, their cybernetic implants shattered, lay sprawled amidst the remains of Imperial guardsmen, their laser guns clutched in frozen hands. The Kroot paid them little heed, their interest lying deeper, guided by the Shaper's increasingly focused psychic sense. These were common genes, nothing to truly sate their hunger for unique evolutionary pathways. Finally, in a command bridge, utterly ravaged by battle, they found him. Or rather, what remained of him. He was a human of significant stature, even in death. His body, encased in power armor of an ancient, ornate design, was slumped against a control console, a massive wound carved into his chest where some horrific weapon had punched through ceramite and flesh alike. One gauntleted hand still clutched a shattered force sword, its hilt glowing with a faint, dying ember of psychic energy. A stylized eye sigil, the mark of the dread Inquisition, was emblazoned on his pauldrons, though scorched and cracked. His face, even in death, bore a grim determination, a testament to an iron will. His eyes, though glassy and fixed on some distant, unseen horror, seemed to burn with an internal fire that even the chill of the void could not extinguish. This was no mere mortal. This was a man forged in the fires of a brutal galaxy, a warrior of faith and fury. And his essence, even now, resonated with a terrible power. Krask approached the corpse cautiously, his quills bristling. He knelt, his keen senses absorbing every detail, the intricate purity seals, the ancient, potent wards woven into the armor, the very aura of zealous fanaticism that clung to the air like a shroud. This was an Inquisitor, one of the dreaded watchdogs of the Imperium, a hunter of heresy and Xenos alike. This was a being whose very existence was antithetical to the Kroot, to the Tau, to almost all sentient life beyond the confines of humanity. The resonance. It sings, Krask rumbled, his voice a low growl that carried an undercurrent of both apprehension and intense curiosity. His warriors spread out, securing the perimeter, their pulse rifles sweeping the shadows. They understood. This was a rare find, a prize of immense genetic potential. The deeper, more complex the intelligence, the more potent the evolutionary traits to be absorbed. The Shapers of the Kroot were the genetic memory banks of their kindreds, the inheritors of every trait and skill, consumed over countless generations. Through them, the Kroot evolved, adapting to new threats, absorbing new abilities, becoming the ultimate chameleons of the battlefield. But never before had Krask encountered a genetic signature so utterly steeped in rigid dogma, in such profound, irrational hatred, and yet such unwavering conviction. Krask reached out, his clawed hand hovering over the Inquisitor's still form. He could feel the latent psychic energy, the echoes of a mind that had wrestled with cosmic horrors and stood unbowed. This was a dangerous meal, one that could twist their evolutionary path in unforeseen ways. But the hunger for new knowledge, for new strengths, was too ingrained in the Kroot psyche to be denied. It was their very nature. He gave a guttural command, and two of his most trusted subordinate shapers, Kale and Vrak, moved to his side. They understood the gravity of the moment. To consume such a being was to invite an unknown future, to graft a piece of a truly alien mind onto their own. But the potential rewards, the strategic insights of a being who had fought the galaxy's darkest threats, were irresistible. With a ritualistic precision, Krask's claws, honed for millennia, began the process. The armored plates were carefully prized open. The thick, hardened skin of the human beneath exposed. The Kroot's digestive system was remarkably efficient, capable of breaking down and assimilating genetic material at a cellular level, extracting the very essence of a creature's being. As Krask and his shapers began to feed, a strange silence descended upon the bridge. The faint, pulsing glow of the fungi seemed to intensify, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the ghosts of the fallen. A low, collective hum began to emanate from the shapers as the raw genetic data flooded their systems. The immediate sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't just the physical properties of the human. It was the mind. Valerius Thane had not been a simple warrior. He had been a force of will, a custodian of humanity, a burning ember of xenophobia and zealous faith. His entire life, his every thought, his every action, had been dictated by the brutal realities of the Imperium. His memories flooded Krask's mind. Vast archives of strategic data, the horrific sagas of humanity's endless wars, the cold, calculating logic of a million purges, the absolute, unshakable conviction that humanity was supreme, and all Xenos were anathema. Krask recoiled, a low, pained grunt escaping his throat. Images flashed before his mind's eye. Burning worlds, impaled aliens, screaming heretics, the grim, unyielding face of the Emperor. He saw galaxies ravaged by warp storms, species consumed by alien parasites, civilizations collapsing under their own inherent weakness. And through it all, the unwavering, brutal resolve of humanity guided by the iron fist of the Inquisition, purging, cleansing, ensuring survival at any cost. His shapers, Kael and Vrak, fared no better. Their quills vibrated violently, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. They felt the cold, analytical gaze of the Inquisitor, judging their very Kroot nature as an abomination. They tasted the visceral disgust, the ingrained hatred for anything that was not of the human Imperium. A chilling thought took root in Krask's mind, not his own, but an echo of Thane's. Weakness is a cancer. Compromise is a lie. Only absolute purity and ruthless strength can ensure survival in this galaxy of horrors. It was a doctrine of grim pragmatism, of xenophobic zeal, utterly alien to the Kroot's fluid, adaptable nature, and yet terrifyingly logical in its own brutal way. The shapers finished their meal, their forms trembling, their minds reeling. The physical sustenance was minor. The genetic, psychic, and ideological assimilation was monumental. Krask slowly rose, his movements stiff, his mind no longer entirely his own. A new voice, cold and authoritative, seemed to whisper in the recesses of his collective consciousness. It spoke of order, of strength, of a greater good that was not about peaceful coexistence, but about the brutal, uncompromising eradication of anything that might threaten the ultimate survival of their species. The kindred of the blood feathers had consumed more than just genetic material that day. They had consumed a philosophy, a doctrine of war and xenophobia, an alien will that would forever alter their path, forging them into something new, something terrifying. The silent ship, the dead Inquisitor, had gifted them a greater good, far removed from the gentle teachings of the Tau, a truth born of fire and blood, ready to be unleashed upon a galaxy already drowning in both. The journey back to the Maw of Vorlog was a silent, unnerving procession. The three shapers, Krask, Kael, and Vrak, walked as if encased in invisible armor, their movements stiff, their quills no longer rippling with natural Kroot curiosity, but held rigid, as if under an unbearable psychic pressure. The Kroot warriors who escorted them glanced nervously at their leaders, sensing the profound shift that had occurred. The familiar, comforting aura of their shapers, usually a beacon of cunning and ancient wisdom, was now cloaked in a chilling, alien stillness. Aboard the war sphere, the initial euphoria of a successful hunt quickly evaporated. The shapers sequestered themselves in the kindred's hearth, the central chamber where genetic memories were traditionally processed and integrated into the collective consciousness. But this time, it was different. This was no ordinary feast of genetic material, no simple absorption of physical prowess or minor instinctual adaptations. They had consumed a mind, a vast, complex architecture of thought and dogma, imbued with the raw, uncompromising will of a forgotten inquisitor. Inside the hearth, usually a place of calm contemplation, a maelstrom of conflicting energies raged. Krask was the epicenter, his massive form racked by internal convulsions. His quills vibrated with such intensity they blurred, and a low, guttural moan, more akin to a human's strangled cry than a Kroot's usual vocalizations, escaped his throat. Images, memories, and doctrines flashed through his mind at blinding speed, a relentless torrent that threatened to shatter his very identity. He saw ancient, sprawling cities of gleaming spires and Gothic cathedrals, teeming with billions of humanity, each soul a tiny cog in an unimaginable machine. He felt the weight of the Imperium, a vast, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless dominion spanning the stars, born of a desperate struggle against primordial chaos. He witnessed the Emperor, a god-king of humanity, a figure of such overwhelming psychic might that Krask's Kroot mind struggled to even comprehend it. But more than the grand spectacle, Krask felt Thane's mind. He experienced the Inquisitor's deep-seated xenophobia, not as a learned prejudice, but as an absolute, undeniable truth. Every Xenos species, every deviation from the human norm, was a threat, a potential vector for corruption, a stain upon the purity of the human spirit. He saw images of Kroot, of Tau, of Eldar, orcs, tyrannids, all branded as Xenos scum, alien filth, abominations to be purged. This primal, visceral hatred, utterly alien to Kroot pragmatism, seeped into Krask's consciousness like a corrosive acid. Kyle and Vrak, lesser shapers, but still powerful conduits, writhed in their own torment. Kyle saw the meticulous records of heresy trials, the chilling logic of extermination orders, the chillingly efficient mechanisms of imperial justice. She felt the cold fire of faith, the unshakable belief in humanity's divine right to rule, and the absolute necessity of crushing all dissent. Vrak, in turn, was overwhelmed by military strategies, orbital bombardment doctrines, and the sheer, brutal efficacy of imperial attrition warfare. Concepts that made the Kroot's usual hit-and-run tactics seem like childish games. He felt the weight of command, the chilling responsibility of condemning millions for the greater good of trillions, a greater good defined not by harmony, but by absolute, ruthless survival. Impurity. A blight must be cleansed, Krask rasped, his voice a distorted, deeper echo of his own, laced with a harsh, unfamiliar cadence. His eyes, usually intelligent and calculating, now burned with an almost feverish intensity, reflecting the unyielding conviction of a man who had seen the abyss and fought it with fire. He gripped his head in his claws, as if trying to physically restrain the invasive thoughts. The Kroot capacity for genetic memory was a blessing, but in this instance, it was a curse, forcing an alien paradigm onto their very essence. The fundamental conflict was excruciating. Kroot instinct dictated adaptability, the consumption of diverse genetic material to strengthen the kindred, to evolve and thrive. Thane's memories, however, screamed of purity, of eradication, of a singular path that brooked no compromise. The Kroot valued cunning and practical survival. Thane valued faith, doctrine, and the uncompromising destruction of all perceived threats. The toe, naive, weak, Kyle muttered, her body spasming. Negotiation, a foolish waste of resources. Extermination, the only path to safety. Her words were punctuated by a dry, humorless chuckle that was not her own, an echo of the Inquisitor's grim assessment of galactic politics. Vrak slammed a clawed fist against the deck plating, a sound of frustrated despair. The Emperor's light, a lie for Xenos, no forgiveness, no mercy for deviation. He felt the surge of zealotry, the unyielding drive to cleanse and purge, a stark contrast to the Kroot's dispassionate, predatory efficiency. Outside the hearth, the rest of the kindred was growing increasingly agitated. They could feel the psychic reverberations, the storm brewing within their shapers, their natural connection to their leaders, usually a source of communal strength, was now a conduit for confusion and a strange, primal fear. Young Kroot warriors, who had never known anything but the pragmatic hunt and the quiet wisdom of their elders, began to chatter nervously, their quills flattening in apprehension. Over the next cycle, the shapers emerged, but they were not the same. Krask's eyes held a cold, unwavering glint, his posture radiating an unfamiliar authority that was less Kroot and more disturbingly human. His voice, when he spoke, was still his own, but the inflection, the emphasis on certain words, purity, threat assessment, sanctioned extermination, resonated with the stern, unforgiving tone of an imperial commissar. He began to restructure the kindred's routines. Training exercises, once focused on stealth and ambush, now incorporated rigid formations, relentless firing drills, and tactical doctrines focused on total annihilation rather than selective hunting. The Kroot diet, usually varied and opportunistic, began to shift. Krask ordered the consumption of specific, stronger genetic samples, while any species deemed inferior or corrupting by the Inquisitor's implanted memories were strictly forbidden. "We must strengthen the kindred," Krask declared to a bewildered assembly of warriors, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing their potential with a chilling, analytical detachment. "We must purge the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities. The galaxy is a crucible of fire, and only the purest, the most absolute, shall endure. The Toe speak of a greater good through unity. They speak of foolish compassion. Our greater good will be forged in the fires of purification, in the absolute eradication of all threats." His words, infused with the Inquisitor's conviction, carried an undeniable weight. Even as the Kroot's primal instincts screamed against such rigid dogma, the ingrained respect for their shapers, the conduits of their evolutionary path, compelled them to listen. They saw the increased strategic acumen, the uncanny foresight in Krask's pronouncements, the sudden, almost prophetic understanding of enemy weaknesses. This, they reasoned, must be the new, potent evolution promised by the strange, dead human. Kael, now acting as Krask's primary tactical advisor, began to draw up schematics for new weapon configurations, modifying their pulse rifles to deliver more focused, devastating volleys, to better reflect the uncompromising firepower she now believed essential. Vrak, in turn, began to impose an internal hierarchy upon the kindred, demanding absolute obedience, punishing even minor infractions with a severity that was utterly alien to Kroot culture. He would often quote, without fully understanding, snippets of imperial decrees or the chilling logic of inquisitorial purges, applying them to the kindred's internal affairs. The internal struggle, however, was far from over. In the quiet moments, when the Inquisitor's doctrine was not actively dominating their minds, Krask would feel flickers of his former Kroot self, the urge for cunning, for adaptability, for the joy of the hunt. But these urges were increasingly overshadowed, almost violently suppressed by the crushing weight of Thane's convictions. It was like two entities fighting for control within a single mind, the pragmatic, evolving Kroot, battling the rigid, xenophobic Inquisitor. "This is not our way." A younger shaper, unfamiliar with the deeper currents, tentatively approached Krask. Our ancestors taught us to absorb, to grow, to become more kultur, diverse, not to reject. Krask turned, his eyes piercing. Your ancestors taught survival, he countered, his voice resonating with Thane's cold logic. And survival demands strength. Weakness invites destruction. Diversity without purity is merely vulnerability. The galaxy is not a garden for all to flourish. It is a battlefield where only the strongest, the most absolute, survive. He paused, a strange, knowing smirk twisting his beak. And sometimes the greatest strength lies in purging that which would weaken the whole. This is the truth the dead human offered us, a truth forged in endless war. The kindred of the blood feathers, henceforth, would be known among themselves as the kindred of the inherited doctrine. They had undergone their crucible of cognition, and from the fires of its torment, a new, unsettling philosophy had been born. It was a philosophy of the greater good, but one warped and twisted by the genetic memory of an inquisitor. A doctrine of brutal pragmatism, xenophobic purges, and absolute survival, ready to be unleashed upon a galaxy that was already too accustomed to horror. The stage was set for a clash not just of arms, but of ideologies. A grim reinterpretation of hope, born from the deepest shadows of despair. The kindred of the inherited doctrine wasted no time in testing their newfound grim philosophy. Their initial target was the Grox herders of the Xylos system, a minor Xenos species of sentient, bovine-like creatures known for their prodigious regenerative abilities and docile, if somewhat dim-witted, nature. They were a species often left unmolested by most factions, considered too primitive for assimilation by the Tau, and too insignificant for imperial attention, occasionally culled for their rich meat by opportunistic pirates. To the Kroot, their strong physical forms and robust cellular structure made them a tempting, if rudimentary, genetic resource. Before the Inquisitor's influence, the kindred would have conducted a swift, surgical harvest, absorbing the Grox herder's regenerative traits without undue cruelty. Now, under Krask's cold, calculated direction, the operation took on a terrifying new character. These Grox herders, Krask intoned, projecting his thoughts to the assembled warriors through the kindred's psychic link, his voice devoid of any Kroot empathy, possess remarkable cellular regeneration. But their minds are simple, their societal structure primitive, their potential for advanced thought minimal. They represent a genetic dead end, a potential dilution of our own evolving intellect if we were to incorporate their mental patterns. Kael, standing beside him, nodded gravely, her quills stiff. Their docility is also a weakness, she added, an echo of Thane's disdain for complacency in her tone. It invites predation. Such weakness cannot be tolerated in the galaxy's crucible. Vrak, who had overseen the tactical mapping of the Xylos homeworld, presented a strategy of total eradication. Their villages are scattered, easily isolated. We will perform a systemic purge. No survivors. Their physical genes will be harvested, but their mental imprint will be utterly excised, discarded as undesirable information. It is inefficient to absorb weakness. The Kroot warriors, accustomed to the efficiency of the hunt, found the sheer brutality of the plan unsettling. Their instincts rebelled against the waste, the unnecessary cruelty, but the unwavering authority radiating from their shapers, now imbued with the Inquisitor's iron will, was undeniable. The genetic memory, the cumulative wisdom of the kindred, recognized the shift in power. Krask and his fellow shapers knew. They held a new, absolute truth, a path to strength that superseded the old ways. The assault was clinical, chillingly effective. Dropping from low orbit, the Kroot war spheres deployed swarms of combat drones, not for direct engagement, but to herd the panic-stricken Grox herders into predetermined killing zones. Then, the Kroot warriors descended. Instead of the customary swift kills for gene harvesting, the kindred of the inherited doctrine employed a method of warfare designed to instill terror and ensure absolute compliance with their new doctrine of purity. Pulse rifle fire swept through the villages, but selectively. Wounded Grox herders, their regenerative abilities kicking in, were allowed to suffer, their cries broadcasting fear across the open plains. Kroot hounds, usually used for tracking and incapacitation, were now unleashed with savage abandon, their purpose to torture and wear down, not simply to kill. The shapers themselves oversaw the harvest. They did not simply feed. They dissected, examined, and discarded. The physical flesh, the robust musculature, the hyper-efficient repair enzymes, these were absorbed with careful precision. But any neural tissue, any part of the brain that might carry the weak mental blueprint of the Grox herders was summarily incinerated by plasma carbines or crushed beneath heavy boots. It was a surgical purge, an act of genetic engineering conducted with brutal, uncompromising force. A particularly disturbing incident occurred when a young Kroot warrior, still clinging to the old ways, hesitated before a mother Grox herder attempting to shield its young. Its large, soulful eyes pleaded a basic, universal, maternal instinct. The warrior lowered his rifle. Before he could even process the nascent act of mercy, Vrak was upon him. The Shaper, his face a mask of cold fury, slammed the butt of his heavy rifle into the young warrior's ribs, sending him sprawling. "Weakness," Vrak hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Sentimental contamination. You would allow this genetic dead end to propagate its inferiority? You would risk the purity of the kindred for a fleeting emotion?" Without a word, Vrak raised his own pulse rifle and expertly shot the Grok's herder mother and its child through the head, instantly vaporizing their cranial matter. He then stared at the fallen warrior, his gaze imbued with the Inquisitor's unforgiving judgment. "Feel that emotion, Kroot. Remember its cost. Then purge it, as we purge all that is unworthy." The warrior, trembling, scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling from the brutal lesson. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had learned that mercy was a contaminant. The purges continued across the Xylos system for weeks. The Grok's herders, incapable of understanding the Kroot's new, terrifying logic, were systematically hunted to extinction. Their entire species was erased from the biological census of the galaxy, not for aggression, not for resources, but for the unforgivable sin of genetic inferiority in the eyes of their new hybrid overlords. Word of the kindred's actions began to filter back to the Tau. Initial reports were confused, then deeply troubling. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had always been aggressive. But this was different. This was not the pragmatic culling of a rival, nor the strategic elimination of a threat. This was a systematic, almost ritualistic extermination, leaving no survivors, no genetic legacy beyond what the Kroot had meticulously selected. The kindred reports complete success, Shaper Krask. Kael announced one cycle, her expression grim but resolute as she reviewed the final kill tallies. The Xylos system is cleansed. No mental contamination. Only the desired physical attributes remain within our genetic pool. Krask stood overlooking the tactical display, which showed the now barren surface of the Grok's herder's homeworld. "Good," he responded, his voice a gravelly murmur. "The first step in true purification. The Toe cling to their foolish notion of assimilation. They seek to uplift the weak, to invite contamination. We will demonstrate the superior path, the path of true strength, true survival." A sense of chilling satisfaction settled over Krask. The Inquisitor's memories, once a source of internal torment, were beginning to integrate, to define his purpose. The logic was undeniable, the conviction absolute. This greater good, born of ruthless pragmatism and unwavering xenophobia, felt inherently right. It was a hard truth for a hard galaxy. The kindred of the inherited doctrine was no longer merely a Kroot kindred. It was a living weapon, a walking paradox, a force that had absorbed the genetic memory of a defunct imperial inquisitor and forged its own brutal, uncompromising philosophy of the greater good. A philosophy built on purity, power, and the terrifying belief that the only way to safeguard their future was to violently prune the galactic tree of all that was deemed unworthy. They were a nascent terror, their first bloody footprints etched across the corpse of a gentle species, ready to clash violently with the idealistic tenets of the Toe Empire. The reports of the Xylos purges, though initially dismissed as an isolated incident of Kroot brutality, eventually reached the ears of the Toe Command. While Kroot auxiliaries were known for their predatory nature, the sheer scale and cold precision of the Xylos extermination, followed by the kindred of the inherited doctrine's dismissive reports, raised alarms. Yet, the Tau, ever pragmatic and eager to integrate capable allies, chose to interpret it as an overzealous application of Kroot natural selection rather than a fundamental ideological shift. When a Tau expeditionary fleet, under the command of Commander Farsight protege Ovesa, sought to expand into the sparsely charted Voldan sector, the kindred of the inherited doctrine, now subtly rebranded by Krask as the vanguard of purity, offered their services. Their recent, brutal efficiency had not gone unnoticed. Ovesa, ever keen to leverage every available asset in the relentless push for the greater good, accepted. The Kroot, after all, were peerless trackers and shock troops, invaluable for softening resistance ahead of Toe colonization efforts. From the outset, their integration was marked by a profound unease. The Maw of Vorlag, usually a bustling hub of Kroot activity, was now eerily silent. Its external hull bore strange, almost geometric markings that mimicked imperial iconography, though distorted, as if seen through a shattered lens. The Kroot warriors themselves moved with an almost martial discipline, their usual boisterous chatter replaced by clipped, precise communications. Their pulse rifles, as noted by Toe weapon cadre technicians, were frequently reconfigured with unusual modifications, favoring destructive power over tactical flexibility. Krask, accompanied by Kale and Vrak, presented himself to Ovesa aboard the flagship, the Light of Unity. The commander, a seasoned veteran of countless engagements, extended a hand digit in greeting. But Krask merely observed it, his head cocked, his expression unreadable. "Shaper Krask," Ovesa began, his tone cordial. "Your kindred's reputation for martial prowess precedes you. We are pleased to have the vanguard of purity join our efforts in the Voldan sector." "Commander," Krask replied, his voice a low growl, but with an unexpected, almost mechanical formality. "Our kindred exists to serve its own greater good. That greater good aligns, for now, with the strategic objectives of the Tau Empire." The qualification "for now" hung in the air, a subtle but distinct challenge. Ovesa's brow furrowed imperceptibly. Such directness, such a lack of traditional Kroot deference, was unusual. Kroot were typically more amenable to Tau guidance, their loyalty secured through mutual benefit. This Kroot, however, carried himself with the austere confidence of an imperial officer. During the initial skirmishes on Voldan Prime, a planet occupied by entrenched orc tribes, the kindred's effectiveness was undeniable. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. Their ambush tactics honed to a razor's edge. But their methods were brutal, even for Kroot. Instead of disabling orc war machines, or isolating leadership for gene harvesting, the Kroot pursued absolute annihilation. They carved bloody swaths through the greenskin hordes, not retreating when overwhelmed, but fighting to the last, as if driven by an unyielding, almost suicidal fanaticism. One incident particularly disturbed the Tau. A small orc encampment, its inhabitants, largely young Gretchen and Snotlings, overseen by a single battle-worn orc nob, was quickly surrounded. The Tau expected a swift, decisive strike to neutralize the threat. Instead, the kindred unleashed a sustained, merciless bombardment of pulse fire and Kroot gun rounds, reducing the entire camp, including the non-combatants, to incinerated ash. Shaper Krask, a Tau fire warrior, Shasui Tolka, demanded later, his voice laced with indignation. Why the complete annihilation? Those were mostly Gretchen, and a single knob, easily captured for interrogation. Krask turned his cold gaze upon the Tau. The orc species, he stated, his voice flat, is a vector of galactic instability. Its genetic imperative is war, its evolution solely geared towards destruction. To allow even the weakest of its kind to persist is to invite future contamination. These Gretchen would mature into warriors, or propagate more of their kind. The greater good demands absolute elimination of such threats at their source, before they can fester. Negotiation with a cancer is folly. Tolka flinched, not just from the harsh words, but from the unsettling logic. It was not Kroot pragmatism, but something colder, more absolute, born of a different, darker philosophical wellspring. Ovesa received multiple such reports. The kindred of the inherited doctrine was ruthlessly effective, but their definition of effective was utterly uncompromising. They refused to take prisoners, rarely harvested gene material, unless it met specific, stringent criteria, and their tactical reports were filled with phrases like threat vectors neutralized, genetic impurity excised, and strategic decontamination complete. They treated even the most primitive Xenos as if they were virulent contagions. Attempts by ethereal Aunshi, who was observing the fleet's progress, to engage Krask in discussions about the Tao philosophy of the greater good were met with polite but firm resistance. Krask would listen, but his responses were always rooted in a logic that, while internally consistent, was entirely antithetical to Tao ideals. The Tao vision is noble, ethereal, Krask stated during such exchange, his posture stiff, to uplift and unify. But it is naive. The galaxy is not a canvas for cooperation, but a battleground for survival. Weakness, even in a potential ally, is a vulnerability. Compassion can be a fatal flaw. The true greater good demands a willingness to make hard choices, to excise the infected limb before the entire body is lost. Aunshi, for the first time in his long career, felt a prickle of genuine fear. This Kroot shaper spoke with a conviction that rivaled that of the most fervent Tao propagandists. But his message was one of absolute, uncompromising darkness. He was not rejecting the greater good. He was redefining it, twisting it into a brutal caricature of its original intent. The Toe Fire caste appreciated the Kroot's raw power, but the Water caste, usually responsible for diplomacy and integration, found the kindred's stance utterly unworkable. The Earth caste engineers, tasked with integrating their strange weapon modifications, reported that the Kroot seemed to be stripping down even advanced Toe technology, seeking raw destructive power and eschewing complex targeting systems or non-lethal options. A deep, unsettling rift was forming. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had proven their value in combat, but their chilling philosophy, derived from the genetic memory of an imperial inquisitor, was beginning to sow seeds of profound unease within the Tao ranks. Their greater good was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a dark reflection of the Tao's own noble aspirations, and it promised to tear through the fabric of their alliances with ruthless precision. The integration, far from being harmonious, was a precarious dance on the edge of ideological war. The initial unease regarding the kindred of the inherited doctrine escalated from disquiet to outright alarm within the Tao expeditionary fleet. Commander Ovesa found himself increasingly besieged by reports detailing the Kroot's unorthodox and brutal methods. The fire caste praised their efficiency. The water caste despaired at their uncompromising xenophobia. The earth caste grew wary of their unsettling modifications to Tau technology. But it was the ethereals, with their profound understanding of the greater good, who recognized the true danger brewing within the kindred. Under Krask's guidance, the kindred's interpretation of the greater good had become a distorted echo of imperial dogma. It was no longer about expanding a benevolent empire, but about establishing a pure one, even if that purity meant oceans of blood. Their actions became increasingly unilateral, bypassing Tau command structures and protocols with cold, unwavering certainty. The first major point of friction, beyond the Xylos purges, occurred on the burgeoning colony world of Phaedra Prime. This verdant planet was home to the Phaedrans, a semi-sentient, arboreal species of graceful, avian-like beings, known for their elaborate tribal rituals and nascent psychic abilities. The Tau water caste had spent cycles meticulously engaging with them, establishing trade routes, and gently guiding them towards the greater good through diplomacy and technological uplift. The Phaedrans were considered a prime candidate for eventual assimilation. The kindred of the inherited doctrine saw them differently. During a routine patrol, a Kroot scout unit from Krask's kindred stumbled upon a Phaedran ritual site. The Phaedrans were engaged in a complex ceremony involving chanting and a strange, shimmering energy field that pulsed from a central, crystalline artifact. To the Tau, this was a cultural expression. To the Inquisitor-tainted Kroot, it was a psychic anomaly, a potential warp-tainted ritual, and thus a grave threat. Without consulting Ovesa or any Tau liaison, the Kroot unit reported their findings directly to Krask. His response was immediate and terrifyingly decisive. "A potential psychic vector," Krask declared, his voice a low, chilling growl over the kindred's internal comnet. Uncontrolled psychic phenomena are a gateway to ruin. The Phaedrans' nascent abilities make them vulnerable, a potential infection point for the entire system. They are a threat to be neutralized before they can be exploited by malign forces. Kael and Vrak concurred instantly, their expressions grim. "Preemptive genetic cleansing," Kael added, "is the only logical course of action." A full Kroot detachment, led by Vrak, was dispatched to Phaedra Prime. Their mission was not reconnaissance, not observation, but surgical preemption. They landed stealthily, bypassing Tau patrols, their presence undetected until it was too late. The massacre was swift and brutal. The Kroot descended upon the Phaedran villages with a terrifying, dispassionate efficiency. The graceful avian creatures, who had learned to trust the greater good of the toe, were caught utterly unaware. Their pleas, their rituals, their nascent psychic cries, all were met with a relentless storm of pulse fire and razor-sharp claws. The crystalline artifacts, identified as psychic conduits by the Inquisitor's memories, were systematically shattered and incinerated. Vrak personally supervised the eradication, his eyes gleaming with a cold, righteous fury that was not his own. He watched as the Phaedrans fell, their blood staining the verdant foliage, and felt no remorse, only grim satisfaction that a potential infection had been cauterized. His warriors, though inwardly recoiling from the sheer scale of the slaughter of an unresisting species, were compelled by the ingrained obedience to their shaper and the overwhelming, persuasive logic of Krask's doctrine of purity. They had been taught that mercy was a weakness, and weakness was a threat. The threat has been eliminated, Vrak reported to Krask, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Phaedra Prime is now cleansed of psychic contamination. When Ovesa finally received word of the atrocity, it came from a panicked toe-water cast diplomat who had stumbled upon the aftermath, a scene of utter devastation and unimaginable cruelty. Entire villages were reduced to charnel houses, the beautiful Phaedran architecture shattered, their vibrant ecosystem stained with the blood of a trusting species. The diplomat barely escaped with her life, her faith in the greater good shattered. Ovesa immediately confronted Krask via hololithic link. The commander's face was etched with fury and disbelief. Shaper Krask, what in the name of the greater good have you done on Phaedra Prime? The Phaedrans were allies, under negotiation. They posed no threat. Krask's image remained impassive. "Commander," he replied, his voice unnervingly calm, "your assessment of threat is flawed." The Phaedrans possessed latent psychic abilities. Such abilities, uncontrolled and exposed, are a beacon to malign entities, a doorway for warp-spawned horrors. To allow them to persist was to invite ruin, not just for Phaedra Prime, but for the entire sector. We acted to ensure the long-term purity and safety of the greater good, our greater good, against potential contagion. "Contagion?" Ovesa roared, slamming his fist on his console. "They were a peaceful species. You have committed an act of genocide. This is not the greater good. This is an abomination." "You speak of idolism, Commander," Krask countered, a subtle sneer touching his beak. an echo of Inquisitor Thane's contempt for weakness. I speak of survival. Your greater good is a dangerous fantasy. My greater good is a grim reality. I have merely accelerated the inevitable, excised a weakness before it could become fatal. The galaxy does not reward sentimentality, Commander. It devours it. The hololithic link snapped shut, leaving Ovesa staring at the blank screen. His face pale with a mix of rage and horror. It was clear now. The kindred of the inherited doctrine was no longer merely a troublesome auxiliary. They were a grave ideological threat, a terrifying distortion of everything the Toe Empire stood for. Their doctrine of purity was a grim, uncompromising philosophy that knew no mercy, no negotiation, only annihilation for anything deemed a threat or impure. The clash was no longer theoretical. It was bloody, catastrophic, and inevitable. The massacre on Phaedra Prime sent shockwaves through the Tau expeditionary fleet. Commander Ovesa, a loyal and pragmatic proponent of the greater good, was personally devastated. Not only had an entire nascent civilization been brutally wiped out, but the act itself was an open defiance of Tau authority and a horrifying perversion of their ideals. The ethereals, particularly Aunshi, watched with growing alarm as the ideological rift widened, threatening to tear apart the fragile coalition of species under the Tau banner. A full investigative panel was convened, comprising members of all Tau castes, along with representatives from the allied Kroot kindreds who were serving with the fleet. The kindred of the inherited doctrine, or the vanguard of purity, as Krask now insisted they be called, was summoned to explain their actions. Krask arrived with Kyle and Vrak, their demeanor radiating an almost chilling composure. They walked into the highly charged chamber with the confident stride of those who believed themselves utterly in the right, completely impervious to the scornful gazes of the Toe and the bewildered, angry stares of their Kroot brethren. Aunshi, his voice unusually strained, began the inquiry. Shaper Krask, your kindred's actions on Phaedra Prime are an unprecedented atrocity. An entire species under the protection of the Toe Empire annihilated. Explain yourselves. Krask's quills bristled slightly, but his tone remained calm, almost academic. Ethereal Aunshi, with respect, your assessment is sentimental and dangerously short-sighted. The Phaedrans possessed latent psychic abilities. History, ancient and terrible, demonstrates the catastrophic danger of uncontrolled psychic phenomena. Such populations are vectors for warp-spawned entities vulnerable to corruption, and can become a beacon for galaxy-spanning horrors like the Tyranids or the servants of the ruinous powers. He paused, scanning the room, as if daring anyone to dispute his logic. Our analysis, derived from vast repositories of inherited knowledge, indicated that the risk of allowing the Phaedrons to continue their development far outweighed any perceived benefit. The greater good demands the preemptive elimination of such threats to ensure the long-term survival and purity of the Alliance, and indeed, of all sentient life under our protection. Inherited knowledge? A Toe Earth caste scientist interjected, her voice sharp. What knowledge could possibly justify such barbarism? What vast repositories are you referencing? The accumulated wisdom of generations, Kyle interjected, her voice echoing Krask's cold conviction. A deeper understanding of galactic threats, a more brutal but ultimately more effective pragmatism in ensuring survival. Your species, Tau, has not faced the horrors we have perceived, the true scale of the dangers that lurk in the void. You are blind to the creeping corruption, to the subtle infiltration. A Toe water caste diplomat, her face still pale from the reports of Phaedra Prime, spoke up. But we sought to guide them, to protect them, to integrate them into the Tau's benevolent care. Your actions undermine the very trust upon which our empire is built. Trust, Vrak scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. Trust is a luxury in a galaxy where every shadow hides a predator. You speak of benevolent care. We speak of absolute security. The Phaedrons represented an unacceptable risk. Their extermination was not an act of malice, but an act of strategic necessity, a surgical cauterization to prevent a greater infection. His tone carried an almost zealous certainty, an echo of inquisitorial self-righteousness. The other Kroot shapers present were visibly agitated. Shaper Gorok of the Clawed Hand, Kindred, a longtime ally of the Tau, slammed his hand digit on the table. This is not the Kroot way. We hunt for strength, for evolution, for the unique traits. We do not wipe out species for an imagined threat. This logic is alien to us. Krask turned his gaze upon Gorok, his eyes narrow. Your ways are soft, Shaper Gorok. Your kindred's path is one of slow, inefficient adaptation. Our path is one of rapid, absolute purification. You consume to add. We consume to refine. You seek diversity. We seek ultimate strength through eliminating all weakness. The galaxy rewards not the adaptable, but the absolute. The argument raged for hours. The Tau tried to appeal to reason, to empathy, to the core tenets of the greater good. Krask and his shapers countered with a chilling, self-consistent logic that prioritized species survival through ruthless elimination of all perceived threats, a greater good forged in xenophobia and brutal pragmatism. They referred to threat level alpha classifications for entire species, contamination protocols for cultural interaction, and preemptive purge as a legitimate diplomatic tool. These were terms utterly alien to Tao philosophy, but chillingly familiar to anyone who knew the methods of the Imperium. Aunshi, his patience worn thin, finally spoke, his voice resonating with an uncharacteristic force. Shaper Krask, your words are a perversion of the greater good. Your actions are an affront to all sentient life. Your kindred has become a danger to the very alliance it purports to serve. You speak of purity, but I see only hatred. You speak of strength, but I see only cruelty. I speak of truth, ethereal, Krask retorted, standing defiantly. The truth that the galaxy has taught us, a truth your people are too soft to accept. Your greater good is a dream. Ours is a grim reality. We do what is necessary for the long-term survival of our species, and by extension, for the true, hard-won, greater good of all who are strong enough to endure. The Ethereal Council's decision was clear. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had become an unacceptable liability. Their doctrine of purity was not merely an aberration. It was an active threat to the Tao Emperor's mission. The consensus was that their unique combat effectiveness, once a boon, was now overshadowed by the profound ideological danger they represented. Ovesa, with a heavy heart, issued the order. The kindred of the inherited doctrine was to be disarmed, their leaders apprehended, and their war sphere quarantined. They were to be re-educated, if possible, or isolated if not. This, however, proved to be an act of dangerous naivety. The kindred of the inherited doctrine, steeped in the paranoia and tactical foresight of an inquisitor, was already several steps ahead. As the Tau fleet began to reposition its assets for the apprehension, a coded message, cryptic and chilling, was intercepted from the maw of Vorlog. It contained only 2 words, repeated endlessly. Threat assessment. Schism confirmed. Purge protocol initiated. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had declared its own unilateral schism. The clash of ideologies was no longer confined to words. It had erupted into open war. The kindred of the inherited doctrine, now fully embracing their self-appointed title, The vanguard of purity did not await the Tau's inevitable attempt at apprehension. Krask, channeling the paranoid foresight and strategic ruthlessness of Inquisitor Thane, had anticipated the Ethereal's decision. His kindred had been subtly rearming, preparing, and charting escape vectors long before the ultimatum was issued. The Tau fleet, repositioning for the disarmament of the Maw of Vorla, was met not with surrender, but with a sudden, devastating betrayal. As Firecast frigates closed in, the Kroot war sphere, instead of powering down, erupted with a barrage of weapon fire. It was not the usual Kroot pulse rifle fusillade, but a more savage, indiscriminate assault. Heavy, modified Kroot guns, their energy outputs pushed far beyond safe limits, tore through the Tau frigate's shields, focusing on command bridges and weapon arrays with chilling precision. The Light of Unity, Commander Oveza's flagship, was barely spared a crippling blow by the swift actions of its bridge crew. Still, the shock of the attack reverberated through the fleet. Never had an allied Kroot kindred turned on the Tau with such coordinated lethal intent. "Shaper, Krask, cease fire!" Oveza bellowed over the open comms, his voice laced with anguish and disbelief. "This is madness. You betray the greater good." Krask's voice, cold and devoid of remorse, cut through the fleet channels. "Commander Oveza, you betray the greater good with your weakness, your sentimentality, your foolish desire for integration of the unworthy. We do not betray. We cleanse. We purify. You have proven yourselves compromised, a vector for galactic infection with your naive diplomacy. This is not madness, Commander. This is surgical necessity. The schism of Vjorn has begun. The schism of Vjorn, as Krask had termed it, began with a horrifying display of the kindred's new, ruthless doctrine. Instead of focusing solely on escape, the Maw of Vorla engaged in a brutal, point-blank firefight. Kroot shuttles, laden with heavily armed warriors, launched boarding actions against the nearest Tau frigates, not to capture or disable, but to neutralize all organic personnel, as Krask's orders stated. Inside the kindred's hearth, Krask, Kael, and Vrak oversaw the operation, their faces grim, their minds a nexus of inquisitorial strategy and Kroot savagery. They had assimilated a vast library of Imperial void combat tactics, focusing on critical systems, flanking maneuvers, and demoralization through extreme violence. On board the Tau frigate, courageous, light, a Firecast honor guard fought valiantly against the boarding Kroot. But these were not the Kroot they knew. These Kroot were faster, more aggressive, their attacks imbued with a terrifying ferocity born of absolute conviction. They moved with a tactical precision that belied their usual skirmisher instincts, their every action calculated for maximum lethality. They were not merely fighting, they were purging. Shas'ui Tolka, wielding his pulse rifle with desperation, watched in horror as a Kroot warrior, its quills bristling, impaled a fellow fire warrior with a Kroot gun bayonet, then summarily executed 3 more with precise headshots before moving on. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just the cold, analytical efficiency of a predator fulfilling a grim directive. "They're not trying to capture," T'Olka screamed into his calm. "They're just killing. Every Tau, every crewman, purged." The kindred made no effort to capture Tau technology, nor to harvest Tau genetic material. The Inquisitor's memories had instilled in them a profound abhorrence for humanity and its allies, deeming all impure and unworthy. To the kindred, the Tau, with their alien physiology and misguided benevolence, were just another species to be eliminated if they opposed the doctrine of purity. The fighting was brief, but catastrophic. 2 Tau frigates were crippled, their crews massacred, their hulls left drifting as burning monuments to the Kroot's brutal turn. The Maw of Vorlog, though taking significant damage from the responding Tau gunships, carved a bloody path through the fleet, its superior knowledge of Imperial void tactics giving it an uncanny advantage against the more predictable Tau formations. As the Maw of Vorlog jumped to warp, escaping the clutches of the enraged Tau fleet, Krask stood on its bridge, watching the fading starfields. His face, illuminated by the tactical displays, was a mosaic of Kroot resilience and inquisitorial resolve. "The first step is complete," he rasped, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "The weak have been exposed, the compromised purged. Now the true work begins. The greater good must be safeguarded by whatever means necessary from all who would dilute its strength." Kael and Vrak stood beside him, their expressions mirroring his grim determination. The internal conflict that had racked them during the initial consumption of Thane's memories had solidified into a terrifying unity of purpose. The Inquisitor's will, grafted onto the Kroot's predatory instincts, had formed a new, terrifying entity. The schism of Viorn was a searing wound in the heart of the Tau Empire's expansion. It was not just the loss of ships and lives, but the crushing blow to their core philosophy. A trusted ally had turned on them, not out of greed or primal savagery, but out of a held, calculated conviction that the Tau themselves were an impediment to a true greater good. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had become an enemy of the Empire, not just militarily, but ideologically, a terrifying mirror reflecting the darkness that lay beyond the optimistic veneer of the toe. Ovesa, staring at the empty void where the maw of Vorlag had vanished, felt a cold dread settle in his heart. The kindred had claimed to have inherited a deeper truth, a harder path, and by their horrific actions, they had proven they were willing to spill any amount of blood to enforce it. The galaxy had just gained a new, unpredictable terror. A Xenos species driven by the fanatical xenophobia of humanity, but with the terrifying adaptability of the Kroot. The hunt for the abominable kindred had begun. The kindred of the inherited doctrine, now hunted pariahs, vanished into the vast, uncharted regions beyond the Tau Empire's reach. But their flight was not one of desperation. It was a calculated withdrawal, a strategic repositioning in the unforgiving game of galactic survival they now fully comprehended. Krask, whose mind was increasingly a fusion of Kroot cunning and Inquisitor Thane's vast strategic knowledge, had a new, driving imperative. To understand the enemy he had now inherited. The Inquisitor's memories, once a chaotic torrent, had begun to coalesce into a coherent, albeit terrifying, internal library. Krask found himself accessing detailed schematics of Imperial vessels, profiles of countless Xenos species, tactical treatises on warp travel, and chillingly specific data on the weaknesses and strengths of virtually every major galactic power. But what truly fascinated him, and what drove the kindred's new trajectory, was the sheer scale of the Imperium's knowledge that Thane had dedicated his life to acquiring, suppressing, or destroying. The Tau are predictable, Krask explained to Kyle and Vrak during a deep warp transit, his voice now almost entirely devoid of Kroot inflections, possessing a chillingly analytical timbre. Their belief in the greater good through unity makes them vulnerable. They seek to uplift, to protect. Our path demands knowledge of every threat, every pathogen, every weakness. The Imperium, despite its inherent flaws, understood the necessity of knowing one's enemy intimately. We must acquire more of this knowledge. Their destination was no random star system, guided by faint, residual navigational data gleaned from Thane's memories. The Maw of Vorlag set a course for a remote, forgotten sector known only as the Glyph Worlds, a region rumored to contain derelict Imperial listening posts, ancient data vaults, and abandoned research stations from a forgotten age. These were places Thane had likely investigated, perhaps even purged, but whose residual data echoes remained. Their first target was a planetary fortress spoon, long abandoned, its surface scarred by ancient wars. Imperial charts, now accessible in Krask's mind, indicated it was once a sector command hub, heavily fortified, containing vast data repositories. The kindred landed stealthily, their newly acquired tactical acumen allowing them to bypass automated defenses that would have stumped even veteran TOW pathfinders. Inside the crumbling fortress, the Kroot warriors moved with an almost reverent precision. This was not a hunt for flesh, but a quest for information. They navigated through labyrinths of sarcophagus-like data coffins, their ancient mechanisms frozen by time and neglect. Krask, Kael, and Vrak, their senses sharpened by Thane's imprint, felt the presence of dormant knowledge, a vast, sleeping intellect waiting to be awakened. The process of consumption here was different. It wasn't about eating flesh. It was about absorbing information. The Shapers, using their unique genetic assimilation capabilities, began to interface with the ancient data reliquaries, touching them, allowing the raw data streams to flow into their consciousness. They acted like biological hard drives, capable of processing and retaining vast quantities of non-biological information. The influx was staggering. Krask's mind was flooded with tactical diagrams of ancient battles, records of forgotten Xenos species, the grim history of countless Imperial crusades, and detailed analyses of warp phenomena. He saw the strengths of the Imperium, its unbreakable faith, its logistical might, its unyielding will. But he also saw its weaknesses, its rampant bureaucracy, its technological stagnation, its internal corruption, and its often blind adherence to dogma over pragmatic necessity. Thane's memories provided the lens, the interpretive framework, through which this new data was processed. Kael found herself delving into records of Xenos biological warfare, detailed descriptions of genestealer cults, and the insidious nature of chaos corruption. Vrak, in turn, assimilated vast libraries of void warfare, siegecraft, and the meticulous process of planetary extermination protocols, the very procedures Thane himself would have authorized. The Imperium, for all its flawed ideology, understood the enemy, Krask mused, a chilling realization dawning on him. They compiled the knowledge necessary to survive in this abhorrent galaxy. Their methods of purging are inefficient, bogged down by ritual and fear. But their knowledge, that is power. The TOW do not possess this depth of understanding of the true horrors that lurk beyond their borders. He felt Thane's internal conflict, the Inquisitor's deep-seated loyalty to the Imperium warring with his own pragmatic assessment of its bureaucratic inefficiencies. This internal contradiction once a source of psychic agony, was now a blueprint for the kindred. They would take the Imperium's knowledge, discard its dogma, and refine its methods into something faster, more efficient, more utterly ruthless. During one such absorption, Vrak encountered a hidden data log detailing Thane's own personal investigations into a minor warp cult within the Toe Empire. The cultists, a disillusioned Earth-caste splinter group, had dabbled in forbidden rituals, unknowingly opening minor rifts to the Immaterium. Thane had, ironically, been tracking this threat before his demise. Vrak presented this finding to Krask. "Commander Tau, Krask," he stated, using the Inquisitor's preferred term of address for his internal superior. "This data confirms our hypothesis. The Tau are indeed susceptible to contamination. This cult, it was active within their own systems, undetected." A grim satisfaction spread through Krask. "Proof," he declared, "of their inherent weakness, their inability to truly comprehend the nature of the abyss. This is why our greater good must supersede theirs. This is why purity is paramount." The kindred spent cycles meticulously sifting through the glyph worlds, consuming data, evolving their understanding of the galaxy. They refined their strategies, their weapon modifications, and their internal organizational structure, all informed by the cold, hard logic of Imperial survival. They became less Kroot in their tactical flexibility and more like a miniature, mobile Inquisition. A terrifying, xenophobic force driven by a brutal, alien iteration of the greater good. The Toe, meanwhile, continued their pursuit, but the kindred's path was erratic, unpredictable, always leading to the deepest, most forgotten corners of the void. Each time the Tau thought they had cornered them, the maw of Vorlach would slip away, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. The kindred of the inherited doctrine was no longer merely fleeing. It was evolving, absorbing the shadows of an ancient empire, forging itself into something far more dangerous than anyone, even its own Kroot brethren, could have imagined. They were becoming a living echo of the Inquisitor, now fully unleashed, armed with his knowledge, but devoid of his humanity, or the Emperor's guiding, albeit brutal, hand. The victory in the Cygnus Rift, a silent, unseen triumph over an insidious foe, emboldened the kindred of the inherited doctrine. It solidified Krask's conviction that their doctrine of purity was the only true path to survival in a hostile galaxy. Yet their actions, cloaked in secrecy, were still largely unknown to the broader galaxy. This would soon change. The kindred, now operating as the vanguard of purity, decided to make its presence known. Krask, whose mind now contained an overwhelming amount of inquisitorial strategic knowledge, understood the importance of decisive, public displays of force, not just for intimidation, but for ideological clarity. The galaxy needed to see the efficacy of their brutal, greater good. Their next target was a disputed sector known as the Bleeding Veil. This sector was a microcosm of the galactic struggle, a crumbling imperial mining world, Valerius Alpha, stubbornly held by a zealous but under-equipped Imperial Guard regiment, a burgeoning Tau Sept world, Numantia, attempting to integrate new client races, and most significantly, a burgeoning Orc Wag, led by the infamous war boss Grossfang, whose green skin hordes threatened to engulf all others. The Bleeding Veil was a constant battleground, a festering wound where no single power could gain lasting dominance. To Krask, this was a perfect demonstration ground. The Bleeding Veil, he announced to his kindred, his voice resonating with authority, is a testament to the galaxy's inherent chaos. The Imperium clings to its ritualistic faith, but its forces are spread thin, its technology stagnant. The Tau attempt their foolish integration, inviting contamination. The Orcs embody pure, unadulterated genetic barbarism. All three represent ideological and physical weaknesses that must be addressed. Their plan was audacious, to cleanse the entire sector, eradicating the Orc threat, proving the Tau's methods insufficient, and exposing the Imperium's vulnerabilities, all while establishing their own brand of order. This was not about alliance. It was about supremacy. The Maw of Vorlach arrived in the Bleeding Veil with devastating speed, making no attempt at stealth. Its approach was detected simultaneously by Tau and Imperial sensors, causing immediate confusion. Was it a new Xenos threat? Or was it the rogue Kroot? Their first target was the Orc Wag. Krask understood that the Orcs, with their unpredictable nature and overwhelming numbers, were the greatest immediate physical threat. However, his tactics were not simply about defeating them. They were about eradicating them, utterly and completely, using the Orcs' own savagery against them. Kael, leading a contingent of elite Kroot gunners, initiated a series of surgical strikes deep into Orc territory, hitting ammunition depots and supply lines with unprecedented precision. These were not mere raids. They were coordinated acts of destruction designed to cripple the Wag's logistics before the main fight began. Meanwhile, Vrak led the Kindred's ground forces in a terrifying new tactic. They would allow small orc warbands to engage Imperial or Tau forces, then fall upon the exhausted victors, showing no mercy to either side. The Imperials, initially viewing the Kroot as another Xenos threat, found themselves paradoxically aided by their attacks on the orcs, only to be turned upon moments later. The Tau, expecting their former allies to target the greenskins, were horrified when the vanguard of purity displayed equal disdain for their own forces. The climax of this phase came on the mining moon of Cathar, where war boss Grosfang himself was marshalling his largest force. The Imperials and Tau had been fighting a losing battle against the orc advance. Suddenly, the kindred of the inherited doctrine struck. They deployed their forces not in open battle, but in a series of devastating ambushes, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain and their enemies' predictable movements. They targeted orc commandos and mech boys with extreme prejudice, knowing these were the linchpins of orc cunning and technological innovation. Kroot gunfire tore through orc battle wagons, not aiming for disabling shots, but for catastrophic detonations, turning the greenskins' own ramshackle machines into bombs. The most terrifying moment came when Krask himself, leading his personal guard, engaged war boss Grosfang. The orc, a hulking brute of muscle and aggression, roared with glee, anticipating a worthy fight. But Krask fought with a cold, almost surgical efficiency. He dodged Grosfang's crude power claw with preternatural speed, then drove a vibroblade, modified with a rare Xenos alloy, deep into the orc's secondary heart. It was not a Kroot kill, messy and primal. It was a precise, targeted execution, a swift cessation of a threat. With Grosfang dead, the wog fractured. But the kindred did not simply disperse them. They hunted the fleeing orcs down with grim tenacity, not for gene consumption, but for absolute extermination. Krask declared the entire orc genetic line in the sector a biological contagion that had to be surgically removed. They pursued every last one, leaving no survivors, burning their encampments to sterile ash. Imperial Guard Commander Volkov, watching the systematic slaughter unfold on his tactical displays, could only stare in horrified awe. The Kroot had done what his regiments could not, completely eradicated the orc threat. But at what cost? And with what motive? He watched as the Kroot, having finished their purge, turned their attention to his own entrenched positions, their intentions clear. On Numantia, Tau Commander Ovesa, having received frantic reports of the Kroot's indiscriminate slaughter of both orc and imperial forces finally grasped the true horror of their transformation. This was not about strategy. It was about a psychotic, genocidal zealotry. He ordered a full withdrawal of TOE forces from the sector, realizing that engaging the kindred would only expose his own populations to their terrifying purges. He had finally seen the wolf for what it was. The bleeding veil was purged. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had established a chilling, blood-soaked peace. They stood alone amidst the ruins, the last active force in the sector. They had not taken it for themselves, not for resources, but simply to cleanse it of all perceived impurities. Krask, looking out at the burning worlds, felt a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction. The Inquisitor's ghost within him resonated with grim approval. The galaxy has seen a taste of true purity, he rumbled, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the bridge. Let them learn. Let them understand the cost of weakness. Our greater good will be understood, even if it must be carved into the very stars with fire and blood. The TOE now knew unequivocally that the kindred was not merely rogue, but fundamentally corrupted. The Imperium, witnessing their terrifying efficiency, feared them as a new, potent Xenos threat. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had made their statement. Their long war for purity had now officially begun. A terrifying shadow cast across the grim darkness of the far future. The TOE Empire, reeling from the schism of Viorn and the subsequent atrocities in the bleeding veil, found itself facing an unprecedented crisis. A former allied species, the very auxiliaries meant to embody the TOE's inclusive greater good, had warped into a genocidal force driven by a philosophy utterly antithetical to their own. Commander Ovesa, now burdened by the weight of these grim events, became the primary architect of the TOE's response. His personal journey, shaped by the betrayal, reflected the Empire's own struggle to comprehend this new, terrifying enemy. Ovesa had once been a rising star, a protege of Commander Farsight, known for his tactical brilliance and unwavering adherence to the TOE's benevolent expansionist doctrine. He believed implicitly in the power of diplomacy, the potential for uplift, and the unifying vision of the greater good. The kindred of the inherited doctrine shattered that idealism. The massacre on Phaedra Prime and the indiscriminate purges in the bleeding veil had etched themselves onto his soul, transforming his optimism into a grim resolve. They are an abomination, Ovesa declared to the ethereal council, his voice stripped of its usual composure, replaced by a steely determination. They speak of a greater good, but it is a twisted reflection, a doctrine of absolute xenophobia, and genocide. They must be stopped, not just for the lives they take, but for the very soul of the Tau Empire. The ethereals, gravely concerned by the ideological contagion the kindred represented, granted Ovesa unprecedented authority to prosecute a full-scale campaign against the rogue Kroot. He was given command of a dedicated task force, the Blade of Unity, comprised of veteran fire-caste cadres, earth-caste engineers adapting countermeasures, and, most poignantly, a contingent of loyal Kroot kindreds deeply shamed and outraged by Krask's perversion of their species' ways. Ovesa immersed himself in the intelligence reports, studying every detail of the kindred's tactics. He noted their shift from opportunistic hunting to highly coordinated surgical strikes. He recognized the chilling efficiency of their purges, the way they prioritized genetic purity over all other considerations. He even began to discern faint, almost imperceptible patterns in their ship movements, traces of a strategic logic that seemed alien to Kroot, but disturbingly familiar to the methods of the Imperium. A realization that sent a cold shiver down his spine. They operate like a smaller, faster version of the human Inquisition. Ovesa confided in his trusted advisor, Chasvre Laike, a grizzled fire warrior whose bonding knife had seen service in countless conflicts. Their xenophobia, their utter conviction in their own purity, their relentless pursuit of threats. It's all there. But without the Imperium's dogma, or its slow, lumbering bureaucracy. Laike nodded grimly. They have taken the worst parts of the humans, Commander, and grafted them onto Kroot cunning. They are a weapon designed to destroy all difference. The pursuit of the kindred became Ovesa's singular purpose. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, a personal burden to atone for the initial misjudgment that had allowed Krask's kind to fester within the Tau fleet. He knew that the kindred of the inherited doctrine threatened not just the physical expansion of the Tau Empire, but its very ideological foundation. If such a monstrous perversion of the greater good could exist and thrive, what did it say about the Tau's own ideals? One particularly harrowing moment occurred during a deep space reconnaissance mission. A Pathfinder team, tracking a faint energy signature consistent with a Kroot war sphere, stumbled upon the aftermath of another kindred purge. It was a research outpost, jointly operated by Tau and a newly integrated reptilian species, the Xylons. The kindred had attacked it, not for strategic gain, but because the Xylons possessed a unique bioluminescent property that Krask deemed unstable and potentially mutagenic. The Pathfinder holos revealed scenes of sickening efficiency. The Xylons were not simply killed, they were systematically vivisected, their bioluminescent organs extracted, studied briefly, then incinerated. Tau scientists, caught in the crossfire, were also ruthlessly executed. The kindred left a chilling message carved into a bulkhead in their modified Kroot glyphs, translated by the loyal Kroot auxiliaries. Purity is paramount. Contamination must be removed. The weak will be purged for the greater good. Ovesa watched the playback, his hand trembling slightly as he reviewed the footage of the slaughtered scientists. The cold, dispassionate cruelty, the almost academic precision of the purge, was utterly horrifying. It was clear that Krask and his kindred were no longer simply savage. They were ideologues, enacting their distorted vision with the unshakable conviction of fanatics. He began to push his fleet harder, his battle strategies becoming more aggressive, more direct. He studied old Imperial tactical manuals, captured Xenos data, anything that might give him insight into how to fight an enemy that blended alien adaptability with human xenophobia. He consulted with his loyal Kroot shapers, trying to understand the core Kroot essence that Krask had perverted, hoping to find a weakness, a chink in the Inquisitor's armor that still lay within the Kroot. They have forgotten the balance, Shaper Borgeth, leader of the allied Clawed Hand kindred, explained to Ovesa. We consume to adapt, to strengthen. They consume to discard, to purify. Their spirit is twisted, Commander. The Inquisitor consumed them as much as they consumed him. Ovesa understood. This was no longer just a military campaign. It was a crusade, a desperate struggle to reclaim the very meaning of the greater good from a monstrous parody. He was no longer just a commander. He was a standard-bearer, fighting to defend the soul of his empire against a dark reflection. His burden was heavy, but his resolve was iron. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had chosen its path, and Ovesa would ensure it led only to oblivion. The relentless pursuit by Commander Ovesa's Blade of Unity task force eventually forced the kindred of the inherited doctrine into a corner. After cycles of cat and mouse, of surgical purges against minor Xenos species, and evasive maneuvers that defied Tau tactical predictions, the Maw of Vorlach was finally cornered in the desolate, nebula-shrouded expanse known as the Shadow Maw. This graveyard of stars, choked with nebula and residual radiation, offered no easy escape, only a final, desperate stand. Krask, his quills now permanently stiffened, his eyes glowing with an unnerving, almost unblinking intensity, knew this was it. The Tau had learned. They had adapted to his Inquisitor-derived strategies, pushing their fleet beyond its normal operational parameters. He felt Thane's grim satisfaction, a sense of fatalistic inevitability that permeated his every thought. This was the ultimate test of their doctrine of purity. Commander Oveza's forces are formidable, Krask stated to Kael and Vrak on the bridge of the Maw of Vorlach, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated with a terrible calm. Their resolve has hardened. They have brought their loyal Kroot brethren, a painful reminder of our former selves, a stark contrast to our absolute path. Kael, her posture as rigid as Krask's, tapped a clawed digit on the tactical display. Their numbers are superior, Commander, and their Kroot auxiliaries will anticipate some of our traditional feints. Precisely, Vrak added, which is why we will not employ traditional feints. We will employ the doctrine of absolute, uncompromising annihilation. This will be a forge. Only the strongest steel emerges. Krask had anticipated this ultimate confrontation. For cycles, even as they fled, the kindred had been preparing. They had cannibalized every piece of technology, every scrap of advanced material, to bolster the Maw of Vorlach's defenses and weaponry. They had consumed the genetic material of only the hardiest, most resilient Xenos species, discarding anything deemed weak or soft. Their very bodies were living weapons, their minds honed to a razor's edge of brutal pragmatism. The battle began with a volley of pulse laser fire from the TOW fleet, designed to strip away the Maw of Vorlach's shields. But the kindred's war sphere, its hull now bristling with salvaged Imperial-grade armor plating and modified Kroot cannons, withstood the barrage with surprising resilience. Krask returned fire with a devastating, coordinated salvo of supercharged plasma blasts, targeting the TOW command ships with chilling accuracy. Focus fire on the Sword of Unity, Ovesa commanded, his voice tight with tension. They're attempting to decapitate our command. Maintain formation. Concentrate shields. The battle descended into a maelstrom of energy blasts, plasma fire, and tearing shrapnel. The Maw of Vorlach fought like a cornered beast, but with the calculated fury of an ancient predator. Kroot fighters, agile and heavily armed, swarmed the TOW lines, performing kamikaze runs to draw fire, while their larger war sphere relentlessly hammered the larger TOW vessels. On board the Maw of Vorlach, the kindred fought with a terrifying, almost suicidal zeal. Their war sphere, normally a sanctuary of evolutionary advancement, had become a tomb ship, a final bastion for their twisted ideal. Kroot warriors, clad in armor, salvaged from Imperial corpses and modified with Xenos bone, charged into boarding actions against tow vessels, not seeking to preserve themselves, but to inflict maximum casualties before they fell. A contingent of loyal Kroot auxiliaries from the clawed hand kindred, led by Shaper Borgeth, boarded the Maw of Vorlag, their hearts heavy with sorrow and anger. They sought to reclaim their brethren, to break the Inquisitor's hold. "Krask! Release them!" Borgeth roared through a comm unit, his voice filled with anguish as he clashed with a kindred warrior whose eyes burned with alien fanaticism. "This is not our path. You have poisoned them. Your path is one of compromise, Borgeth." Krask's voice echoed back through the war sphere's internal comms, cold and unwavering. "My path is one of absolute purity. You are a genetic relic. We are the future. The weak will be purged, Kroot and Tau alike, for the true, greater good." The fighting within the Maw of Vorlag was particularly brutal. Kroot fought Kroot, brother against brother, a tragic civil war fueled by ideological perversion. The loyal Kroot fought with fury, but the kindred of the inherited doctrine fought with the terrifying conviction of fanatics, their attacks imbued with a chilling precision born of the Inquisitor's martial training. They fought not to win, but to cleanse, to remove all impurity, even if it meant their own destruction. Krask, now wielding a massive, custom-built Kroot rifle axe that hummed with a suppressed plasma field, moved through the corridors like a force of nature. He engaged Borgeth in a duel, their blades clashing, sparks flying. Borgeth was a skilled warrior, but Krask fought with a strength and ferocity that transcended Kroot limits, his every move reflecting Thane's ruthless combat doctrine. "You have forgotten your true nature," Borgeth cried, parrying a savage blow. "I have embraced it," Krask countered, his eyes blazing. "The nature of the galaxy, kill or be killed. My greater good is survival at any cost." The Maw of Vorlag began to sustain critical damage. Its power conduits flickered, explosions rocked its hull, and internal atmospheric breaches began to tear through its decks. The Tau fleet, though heavily damaged themselves, had finally broken through the Kindred's defenses. Yet, even facing imminent destruction, the Kindred of the inherited doctrine did not break. They fought to the last, their ferocity undiminished. Krask, seeing the inevitable, did not despair. He saw it as a final, glorious demonstration of their purity a testament to the fact that they would rather die than compromise their doctrine. We have shown them the true face of necessity, Krask rasped to Kyle and Vrak as the bridge began to buckle around them. Our legacy will be one of absolute conviction. They will remember the vanguard of purity, the Maw of Vorlok, a monument to both Kroot adaptability and imperial xenophobia, detonated in a blinding flash of light and raw energy, tearing apart a tow cruiser that had dared to move too close. The Shadow Maw was illuminated by its demise, a final, violent testament to the kindred's unwavering, destructive will. Ovesa watched the explosion, his face grim. The battle was won, but the cost was immense. The kindred of the inherited doctrine had been annihilated, their warped greater good extinguished. But the memory of their terrible conviction and the chilling truth that such a monstrosity could be forged from the genetic echoes of a defunct Inquisitor would forever haunt the Tow Empire. The galaxy had shown them once again that even the noblest ideals could be twisted into unimaginable horrors.